And I am so glad that the Reverend Meg Riley is here to offer our keynote and shape this conversation for us. Meg and I work together closely at the Unitarian Universalist Association, especially on our faith's public witness. I learned a great deal from Meg. And lesbian, bisexual, and gay. She built the UUA's Washington office into a real presence for our faith in DC. And she headed up the Advocacy and Witness staff group during my presidency, serving on the Leadership Council throughout that time. She has lived a lot of history in our work for justice. And since retiring, she agreed to serve and was elected one of the co-moderators and chief governance officers of the UUA, the highest volunteer position in the association. Meg, you bring so much to this conversation, and I'm just delighted that you are here. So for the schedule, many of you who were a little early saw it on the screen, but in a moment, Meg will offer her presentation. And after that, we'll take a brief human needs break, and then we will have remarks from two responders. Reverend Tom Disrude, who's the Associate Minister here at First Unitarian, who needs no introduction to most of you, and the Reverend Sean Parker Dennison, Minister of the Rogue Valley UU Fellowship, and one of the co-founders of Trust, Transgender Religious Professional UUs Together, which is a support and advocacy group for trans and non-binary UU religious professionals. Each of the responders will offer some personal observations, and each will also ask Meg a question. And then we will open up for questions from any of you. When we get to that part of the program, we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat. We're going to have to keep you all muted. That's really the only way we can manage a group of this size. I'll read your questions for Meg from the chat. Okay, we're all clear, I hope. Again, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Reverend Meg Riley.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's an honor to be here. You know, when we talked about this in Southern California, I was really excited about leaving Minnesota's frigid winter in January and being back in Portland, which I love and where I lived for 5 years. And I'm really sorry I'm not there. On the other hand, when I look at the people who are here, I see that people have joined us who couldn't have joined us from all over. And so it's a mixed blessing. And who knew when you were doing that cutting edge work on online, offline community, how valuable it would be in this time of COVID. So anyway, it's really a joy to be here. It's a joy to learn together, to have Tom and Sean chiming in with things I won't know about. And so I'm just gonna launch in. Here we go. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. Okay, Jai. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses, and Moses said, here I am. Burning bushes appear in many ways. Those moments when we feel called by something deeper, something eternal, and we respond, here I am. The bushes, of course, are always part of a larger landscape. Moses was in the desert tending sheep. Okay. I want to thank Jai, my 24-year-old, who's doing amazing work as tech, but I'm kind of waving my arm like, no, it's a simple tech here. Burning bushes appear in many ways. Those moments when we feel called by something deeper, something eternal, and we respond, here I am, from our deepest souls. The bushes, of course, are always part of a larger landscape. Moses was in the desert, and in my case, I was directing a UUA office, the office of what was then lesbian, bisexual, and gay concerns. For Moses, the call came through a bush that wouldn't burn up. For me, the angel of the Lord appeared in a propaganda hate film made in 1992 called The Gay Agenda. That angel's demand that I claim my place and say, here I am, changed my life. And while my results were not as dramatic as those of Moses, I had plenty of adventures, which I'm excited to share with you today. That horrific film caused an angel to say to me, not on my watch, you don't. These are my people. My response took place in particular times, and I am a particular person. Each of you arrives with identities, experiences, opportunities, privileges different from and similar to mine. Your own burning bush moments may have happened years ago. You may be in the throes of one today, or you may be scanning the horizon to hear a call, or maybe all of those things are true. I'm excited to hear how these stories from my life might be a tool for transformation for everyone in particular ways. And I'm very excited that Sean and Tom will share some of their own perspectives and histories. So I just need to start by saying that I'm profoundly aware of the ways that my identities, my being a white person, a cisgender person, a person with no visible disabilities, have made it easier for me to do the work that I've done and be the person I am. I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian, I've always been fat. These identities have cost me some authority. But as I share my stories, I'm acutely aware of all of the human devastation I have witnessed within Unitarian Universalists, leveled at bisexual, transgender, gender nonconforming, gender queer, differently abled, indigenous, Black, people of color. The pain that's been caused is real and profound. And I look back in some ways and regret my own lack of courage and kindness. And my dream is that we will somehow find our way to reparations. I'm also aware that it's a radically different time now than the time I'm going to talk to you about. Obvious from the fact that the name of the office I served in that time was the Office of Lesbian and Gay, and I actually added bisexual. It's now called the Office of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Ministries. Leadership now is in almost every arena of Unitarian Universalism, much more multicultural. Queer ministers serve in every size of church. Gender is understood in radically more inclusive and non-binary ways. I pray that we continue to become more welcoming, more diverse, more genuinely multicultural in the days and years ahead. Meanwhile, I'll share some stories that I hope will be of service. May the mistakes I made, may my lapses of courage and kindness and wisdom be recognized as opportunities for transformation and reparation. And may each of our own souls and our collective soul be called to deepen into the work which is yours and ours to do for the liberation of all. So I took up the reins of this office in 1991. I was on my way to ordination in a brand new ministry track called community ministry. And I was half-time in the office and half-time was interning in a congregation in Roxbury, Massachusetts that was triple yoked, UU, United Church of Christ, and Disciples of Christ. And it was centered in Black liberation theology. I moved from a full-time job directing the UUA's youth office to this half-time job, in part to give myself more bandwidth to do the work for ordination. Also, though, I was being transformed by my time at Church of the United Community. There, I was seeing church in a way I'd never known it before. I was seeing church as the hub for organizing racial and economic justice in a Black church model. You know, so often UU churches are imagined as sanctuaries, places where we get away from the pain of the world. And here was this church right in the heart of Roxbury, Massachusetts, a neighborhood which has since been profoundly gentrified, but at that time was the hub of Boston's Black community. Malcolm X grew up there. At that time, AIDS was an epidemic, crack cocaine was everywhere. I spent a year there stunned. My theological education in a white middle-class UCC seminary back in Minnesota, completely inadequate for me to minister in that setting. And I wondered constantly, if this group of people with so few resources can do so much, What could Unitarian Universalists do with all of the leadership, all of the wealth, all of the resource that we have to transform the world? As I share my story, I'll be naming a lot of other people, and it's not because I like to name drop. It's because this work is done by so many people, including many of you whose names I see. None of us could do it alone. And if I don't name you, I hope what I will say will remind you of your own stories. And maybe you'll want to put those stories onto the UU Retired Ministers and Partners Association history. I'll share also some occasional pictures of the people I mentioned, just to relieve you of the tedium of one talking head. So I'll begin by lifting up Dorothy Emerson and Judy Wells, two UU ministers who both used a great deal of their final days on earth to gather UU histories around GLBT equality. This is the Rainbow History website, which I hope that you will be part of. Will you show Judy and Dorothy, please? There they are. Yeah. Judy also transcribed, bless her heart, another talk that I gave. And thus I, for once, knew what I had said. So she worked incredibly hard, and there are the two of them. So that website that you saw before, which I will put up again, uurainbowhistory.net, includes many stories from all kinds of people, and you could add your own, and I hope you will think about it. It is my opinion that when it comes to LGBT and queer rights, UUs have changed history. On many other issues that we're involved with, we are not the dog, we're the tail. But on this one, without us, I'm convinced history would be different for the entire nation if it weren't for us. Okay. And we don't tell our stories enough. If you look at Wikipedia, we're not there. We just don't insert our points of view. And I think we need to do it not to brag about ourselves, but because some of the work that was done is important to name. The Rainbow History Project is also creating a book to share some of these stories. Among the other chapters, the Reverend Mr. Barb Grieve and Alex Capitan are writing a history of trust, which Sean is one of the co-founders of, and all kinds of stories will be in there. So I hope we'll all buy the book too and learn from that. Meanwhile, back to 1991. So I was half-time in the lesbian gay office and half-time at Church of the United Community. And it was really a time of great awakening for me, especially about whiteness. I really, honestly, even though I'd been working on racial justice, it had kind of never crossed my mind that I was white and that I walked around with white privilege as a white person. And I started to deepen into this understanding and looking at the poverty and the AIDS in that community. And I was also part of the UUA's work, which was then called Racial and Cultural Diversity work that Reverend Mel Hoover was leading. And for me, all of these issues of oppression and identity became deeply interwoven. I knew that because of the actual lives of people lived around me. Even though I hadn't yet run into Kimberly Crenshaw and the concept and word of intersectionality. So just to be clear, because I hear the word intersectionality thrown around a lot, what I mean by it broadens out from the legal term that Crenshaw coined in 1989. She was a lawyer, and what she looked at was the fact that Black women, because of the intersection of being Black and being women, suffered from a kind of discrimination which might not be racial discrimination, and it might not be gender discrimination. It was intersectional discrimination. And because it didn't fit into either of the existing categories, oftentimes courts would say it didn't exist. So she coined this term, intersectionality. Will you show a picture, please? That's Kimberly Crenshaw. So when I use it, I'm broadening it out more. And I wanted to, even though it's a little bit out of sequence, I wanted to show a video of one of my mentors, Dr. Elias Farajajeh, Dr. Ibrahim Farajajeh, Ibrahim Baba, giving a talk in 1995 at the NGLTF Creating Change conference called Queers in the Intersection. I'll talk more about him later, but even more than 25 years later, I still think no one can present intersectionality as profoundly as he can because he embodies it so completely. So we'll hear from him for a moment.
offer us new ways of looking at queers in intersection. Queers in intersection where we admit that there is no longer any such thing as being just queer, where we move beyond either or thinking, where being queer means also being a Filipina, dyke-identified single mom with HIV who risks losing custody of her child for a whole host of reasons. And ain't she a queer? Where being queer means acknowledging the particular issues of queer women of color in their struggle against multiple oppressions, and ain't they queer? Where queer means acknowledging that it is impossible to understand these issues without a class analysis of the socio-political, economic factors contributing to sexism, and sexism understood as systemic oppression, not just people not being nice. As compounded by white supremacy, which is not just bad redneck white people. And ain't we all queers? Without sexism and gender oppression, heterosexism could hardly exist. Queers in intersection where being queer means acknowledging that race, class, gender, sexuality, spirituality are not monolithic, distinct categories, where we as queers can see an understanding of race that must include an understanding of elements of class, gender, sexualities, geography that go into shaping notions of race. How race, gender, sexuality, geography go into shaping notions of class. How race, class, and sexuality are factors and facets of shaping gender. How the war against women and their bodies from the burning times until the beginning of the dismantling of abortion rights is connected to the masculinization of healing, to the hardening of Christian religious dogma, the driving out of the goddess, the abuse of the earth, to the expulsion of the other, of Muslims and Jews from Spain, is connected to the slave trade and the invasions of the Americas, where Africans and indigenous peoples were massacred because they were considered to be like women, incarnations of evil, unbridled lust, too connected to the body and sex, and where the earth was destroyed because, like women, it was wild, like dark-skinned people, it needed to be dominated and controlled.
No one does it like he does, right? He just keeps moving out and out and out. And that is, if you ever had the pleasure of knowing him, exactly how he lived. But in my own limited way, I was trying a much simpler and less expansive version of intersectionality. When I went into the office, the first thing I did was create teams of trainers to train people to lead the hot off the presses welcoming congregation. And I made sure that every leadership team was racially mixed, gender mixed as I understood it at the time, which for me then meant a cisgender male and a cisgender female, and mixed by sexual orientation. Of course, the people who came for the training were not racially mixed, though they were mixed in some other ways. The trainers of trainers were racially diverse, but it was still an overwhelmingly white event, despite my hopes. I took the office kind of thinking that the radical part of my life would be the Church of the United Community in Roxbury, and that the UUA would be more of a desk job, curriculum management and talking on the phone, that kind of thing. But immediately when I got there, I started getting calls from all over, from people with amazing stories to tell. A health teacher in Kansas who got fired just for mentioning safer sex and AIDS. And then immediately when I came into the job, in Oregon, ballot measure 9 was on the ballot, and in Colorado, Amendment 2 was on the ballot. Measure 9 would have added the following text to the Oregon Constitution. All governments in Oregon may not use their monies or properties to promote, encourage, or facilitate homosexuality, pedophilia, sadism, or masochism. All levels of government, including public education systems, must assist in setting a standard for Oregon's youth, which recognizes that these behaviors are abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse, and that they are to be discouraged and avoided. Amendment 2 in Colorado was, compared to that, kind of homophobia light. All it did was take away civil rights. Amendment 2 prohibited localities, and a number of cities in Oregon had put in place protective ordinances. Amendment 2 would say that those were all illegal and that gay, lesbian, bisexual people could not have any rights. And that's the way the language was written. So I started getting calls about these campaigns, and I heard that First Church Portland had put a big red ribbon around itself and declared itself a hate-free zone. Marilyn Sewell said, and she tells this story on the Rainbow History website, that it was the queer youth in the church that came to her and suggested she did it, and she did. She was a brand new minister there. But I didn't know what to say to anybody. I just would say, oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. That was kind of all I had. I remember a woman from Portland named Peggy McComb, whom some of you may have known, called me just sobbing, saying, we're under assault. What are you going to do? And I said, cry with you? I had no idea how to help. Ballot Measure 9 failed in Oregon. Amendment 2 passed in Colorado, though later the Supreme Court did throw it out. I want to pause now and watch the trailer for a film about Ballot Measure 9. I will warn you that it is filled with hateful and violent images, and encourage anyone who will be traumatized by that to turn off your sound and go get a glass of water or do something else for the next 3 minutes. But we're going to watch the trailer for the movie Ballot Measure 9, which you can still stream online, the whole movie, which I recommend to you.
Homosexuality and lesbianism, sadism and masochism is wrong behavior. That's why we filed Measure 9, to give you an opportunity to vote on it.
Yes or no! Yes or no!
What I'm trying to get you to see is that this is a war.
People died in Oregon because of the campaign.
I want you all to read Measure 9. Every public school shall assist in setting a standard that recognizes homosexuality as abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse.
The legal restrictions, not only did you not have civil rights, but that you had no recourse for getting civil rights.
Yes or no!
They could persuade one of my grandchildren to become a homosexual.
Homosexuality and Christianity are diametrically opposed.
God's going to bring judgment.
Just follow me. Yes, yes.
And they want to tell our kids that homosexuality is good and normal.
Excuse me, this won't happen in my community. We need to do something about it. These are my sisters and brothers you're talking about.
We have a saying in Spanish that sí se puede. Yes, we can unite, and yes, we can fight back.
That is why I vote with you. No, I'm not.
I see Measure 9 as just an intent by a group of people to run this country under fascist standards.
Jewish people are citizens. You know, it's totally different when you're beating up a gay person than when you're beating up a total citizen.
There's a very strong sense of imminent danger. Gay and lesbians that are working on this issue are moving in pairs now.
You better just watch out, because we're coming, and we're coming hard. You're dead.
2 times they pried the back doors off the house, and then the death threat came through the window.
And one of the young men picks up a shard of that broken glass and grinds it into the eyes of that gay man.
As I was getting up, he kept hitting me in the back. He had his strength on his side, gravity on his side.
The Molotov cocktail was thrown into her window.
Brian, he was laying right here and he looked severely burnt.
Hattie died in the fire and Brian died the following day. I believe she was definitely targeted.
I kept a loaded shotgun in my bedroom until the elections.
Measure 9 equals violence. The OCA has opened up a Pandora's box of hatred that has undermined civility, safety, and democracy.
Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh, yes, I know. 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 Oh, yes,
Just take a moment to breathe with that. Because while that initiative failed, 44% of Oregonians voted for it. Right after the election, I went to the annual conference of NGLTF, a conference called Creating Change. I went to that primarily because NGLTF had spoken out about the Iraq War. Frankly, I had always found gay politics very white, very male, very middle class centered in a way that left me bored. But when NGLTF spoke out about the Iraq War, and they were trashed by a number of people, what does that have to do with us? How dare you? I thought, hey, maybe these are my people. So I went to the conference knowing very few people there. It was 1992. In the opening, Urvashi Vad, who was then the executive director, read a letter from newly elected President Bill Clinton. We had just lived through George Bush and Ronald Reagan, neither of whom had ever acknowledged gay or lesbian people, much less bisexual or transgender. They had never talked about AIDS or acknowledged the epidemic that was killing so many beloved people around us. Clinton had run on a very pro-gay platform, which didn't go too well once he got into office, but he at least had the intentions of things like letting gays into the military, which turned into Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And he is the president who passed the Defense of Marriage Act, but we didn't know about that yet. But at the time, I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, it's a new day, it's a new moment. And it was at this conference that I learned about something I'd never heard of called the religious right. I had two main teachers, Suzanne Farr and Scott Nakagawa, who had just come from Oregon working on ballot measure 9. And though that's Scott right there. That's him now. He didn't look like that in 1992. He's a Portlander. I hope many of you know him. He's still a wonderful organizer. And Suzanne Farr. And she had written that book that I had loved, Homophobia, Weapon of Sexism. Anyway, they had come from Oregon. Scott lived there. Suzanne had gone there to work on ballot measure 9. And though, as I told you, I'd been offering pastoral support to people about it, I really had not had a picture of what it was like for them there. And so I learned about it. Scott had worked with a group that the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, had spun off called People of Faith Against Bigotry, and the UUs were very active in that. And Suzanne's drumbeat then, and though it's expanded, the truth of it has remained the same. Sexism, racism, and homophobia unite the right and divide the left. Both of these teachers had profoundly intersectional understandings of the work that was necessary to move forward. Now, I should tell you that at this conference and often in the queer community, I think I looked like a right-wing infiltrator to people because I looked like I still look, kind of like a church lady. So in queer circles, I was the church lady, and believe me, that was not a positive thing. And in church circles, especially interfaith circles, I was the radical lesbian. It was an interesting life. So I was kind of uncomfortable. There was no worship. We didn't sing, you know, I was a church lady. And then I met this guy who looked even more ill at ease than I was in this polyester suit and just kind of stiffly standing on the edge. And he turned out to be Reverend Mel White, who had written the autobiographies of Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell. He's the one in the clerical collar before coming out. And he was there to try to figure out how to make some amends for the homophobia he'd participated in. And that's also where I met Elias Farajage, there holding his brand new baby, who's now a wonderful adult, and got to know him as well. And these people became foundational in my life and in my work. And that's where the burning bush spoke. We watched that movie, The Gay Agenda, which it turned out had been distributed in churches in Oregon and Colorado to influence voters. Some of you probably have seen it because in the early 1990s, I made people watch it over and over to understand what we were up against. It began with ominous music and black and white footage of the leather community floats in pride parades, and this ominous voice saying, "This is what gay people want to do to your children." And it went on with lies and threats. It was hateful, and it was being distributed in church parking lots everywhere. So when I saw that movie, something just enraged me. I saw that even though all of these organizers were at work, the primary objection to equality was coming in steeped in a, to my opinion, fake religious voice. And the religious community was not speaking back. The voice speaking back, in fact, was terrified of religion because religion was known only as a very negative force. So on the plane on the way home, I did something I'd never done before. At that time, you could push a little receiver out of the seat, you know, and I did that, and I called Bill Schultz, who was UUA president at the time. And I said, when I get back, I need to meet with the executive team. I need to talk to you about something going on that we need to deal with. And I think he was so stunned because before that, I'd kind of just been this bureaucrat. So he said, okay, come next week. So I did, and I showed them that movie, and I said, this is what's going on, and this is what we need to do about it. We're the ones. By now, I had finished my internship at the Church of the United Community. And so I started to spend extra time in a little office in Cambridge called Political Research Associates, which was a think tank about the right wing. I went in and I read their whole library of anti-gay stuff because to me, the logic just seemed so circular. We hate people because gay people because they're evil, and they're evil because we hate them, and we hate them. And I was like, what is this? You know, what is this? So I read and I read, and my eureka moment came reading a book called Dare to Discipline by Dr. James Dobson, the founder of the, which one's he the founder of? God, it's been a while. The one in Colorado Springs, Focus on the Family. Thank you. A really enormous group that had their own zip code in Colorado Springs. He said in that book, and it's about child raising is what it's about. And I am a religious educator by vocation, so I know child development. He said, if your child breaks something or, you know, does something like that, you know, give them a timeout. But if they ever say no to you, you must hurt them. Because if you do not hurt them when they defy authority, they will never know God. Do you hear that? That is a God that is not the God of universalism right there. That is not a God of love. The God that can only be known through fear and obedience. That's that authoritarian streak. And gays are disobedient, right? Because if we were obedient, we would be doing what God told us to do because God is a straight white man. So when he said that, I just thought, again, this is our time. We're the universalists. We're the ones who say that is not who God is. And that just crystallized for me what a faith crisis we were in. That authoritarianism is antithetical to the inherent worth and dignity of every person and to the interdependent web that we affirm. So part of the reasons that the connections that I made at Creating Change became so strong is that I was really kind of out there alone in the field of religion. There were groups like Dignity and Integrity that were the gay subgroups, but those were groups where people from various faiths came to kind of huddle together and recover from the abuse that they were suffering in their own denominations, or to strategize about what to do about that abuse. Or at that time, so many Protestant So many Protestant ministers who were closeted came and talked to me about would Unitarian Universalism work for them, because they'd be fabulous ministers, but if they came out, there would be a trial and they would be fired. And that's the world it was. So there was nobody really besides the Metropolitan Community Church and the United Church of Christ and the UUs and the Reformed Jews who were remotely prepared to respond to this. And nobody but us had an office like we had. I remember Elias called me right after Creating Change. And if you ever met him, you know that when you meet him, you know him. He knows you, you're connected. That's just it. So he called me and we'd only talked for a few minutes, but he began to talk to me. He was a professor at Howard, at the Divinity School at Howard. And he began to talk to me about the homophobia at Howard and what he was dealing with as he came out as bisexual, or he defies labels. I'll just say this about that person. He defies any label you'll put him on him, but he was queer. So I started introducing him to Unitarian Universalism, and that's one of the things I'm happiest about in my life, is getting to know him and to learn what I learned from him. So because I was kind of the only religious person really out there and able, I started getting all these invitations to go stand next to people from ACLU or People for the American Way or other secular groups. And I put on a clerical collar because they didn't want to look anti-religious, which is what they were accused of whenever they labeled this group as hateful. The image that I always used was that the Christian right was like cheap furniture where there's a veneer of wood on top, but it's really made of something else. That the veneer was religion, but that the substance of that table was purely political organizing. I was on fire. I said yes to everything. I spoke on TV. I spoke at universities, at churches, anywhere I could to try to stop this force that was coming at us. And Bill Schultz said he would support me in spending more time in Washington, D.C., where I was increasingly being asked to be part of coalitions. And so I started going to all kinds of coalition meetings where I learned all of the assaults that the religious right was launching, not just on GLBT people, but on a host of people. And I saw the deep connections between everyone who was impacted by this. So I started getting involved in the issues of the people in that coalition. And I remember some of the white gay men getting very upset that I was talking about things like public education or childcare or healthcare and saying, what, that's not a gay issue. And I remember at one point I just crabby hand wrote a sign and said, this is not the office of gay white men's concerns. Put it on my door. Because I think even understanding what that office was there to do was really in question. In 1993, no, it was 1992, it was after the election, maybe early 1993, we went to a meeting to debrief the votes in Colorado and Oregon. And I remember that the strategy of the groups was to get 51% of the voters to vote against these ordinances, which is a good, 51% is a good number. We know it can be a very important number. And it's not what we as people of faith are doing. We're not after 51%. We're talking about everyone. And that's when I met Donna Redwing, who you saw speaking as one of the organizers in Oregon, because she bonded with me. She said, these people who are angry, who voted against us, are not going to go away just because they lost this. You know, we need to keep organizing. We need to keep figuring out what's going on here with these people. And so we became very close. We talked a lot about the urban-rural split and how even then you could see what was going to happen and what we can see on any electoral map now, the huge divide in perspectives between urban and rural. Donna and I became very good friends until tragically she died of cancer a few years ago. So in 1993, we had GA in Charlotte, North Carolina. And at that time, anytime we met in a state that had a law against what was called sodomy, we would have a protest. And so I invited Elias Farajage to come down to that General Assembly and speak at that protest. And I met someone named Mandy Carter, who lived in North Carolina and came over to speak at that protest. And we had a big rally about it, and it was very strong. And soon after that, I'm thrilled to say that Elias applied to move out to Star King Seminary, where he spent a long time transforming hundreds and hundreds of people's lives. And I encouraged him to apply. And I remember saying, you know, the homophobia will get a lot easier, the race will get a lot harder. And I think he would say that that was certainly borne out in his life. But he just did amazing work with his big self. But back in 1992, the right was putting hateful initiatives at every state, local level, and nationally. People like Ralph Reed's Christian Coalition were going around organizing churches to do this. Stealth candidates were running for school boards and library boards. There was censorship, there were book burnings. It was just a time of real right activism, trying out things. UUs were very active in all of these initiatives all over the country, often behind the scenes, because if it was Christian people claiming to be Christian in what they were doing, putting somebody who's also Christian in response to say that's not Christianity made a lot of sense. Organizing in the Black church was especially important because after that movie that I talked about, The Gay Agenda, the next movie they tried, and they're always trying new ones, was called Gay Rights, Special Rights. And what that movie did was lift up civil rights movements, which were good because they were based on immutable characteristics like race versus, you know, how the GLBT movement was trying to hijack that and use it for something it didn't belong. And so they were putting Black people, Black ministers out front to talk about, you know, to promote this. So again, a response was really needed from other people in the Black church specifically. People like Reverend Tim McDonald, a Baptist minister in Atlanta, who's still doing great organizing. I just saw him on a panel with their new Senator Raphael Warnock, but you know, he was speaking out about that. So they were trying a ton of homophobic ballot initiatives. In 1994, they put things on the ballot again in Oregon, in Idaho, and the UUA, through the ministers in Pacific Northwest, hired organizers to stand up against these, to work against these. And I was supporting them as best I could. They had hate-free Sundays and all the churches put red ribbons around them. And I remember driving through rural Oregon, coming up to Corvallis and seeing that red ribbon in 1994 and feeling so relieved to see it because there were so many signs. Oh, you know, there were amazing individuals at work in those times, but organizationally, the interfaith partners from the mainstream church were just not there at all. They were all engaged in their own struggles. And if I have time at the end, I have a very kind of funny story about that, but we'll see. So in response to the emergence of a group called the Promise Keepers, I helped to start a new organization called Equal Partners in Faith, which was specifically created to link homophobia, racism, and sexism. Nobody else in the religious community would speak up against the Promise Keepers because they had a huge budget for PR and their number one talking point was, we're not religious. I mean, we're not political, we are religious, we're only religious. So that makes it really hard to speak out against them because you're speaking against religion. And so none of the religious people wanted to do it either because what they had, again, out front was racial reconciliation as their front. And Bill McCartney, the football coach who was their founder, was a friend of Jesse Jackson's, but also was a big actor out in Colorado around Amendment 2, was a huge believer in what's called conversion therapy, you know, really wanted to deny rights to GLBT people and also to reinstate men as head of households and women as very secondary. So I ended up putting on a clerical collar and doing a whole lot of national media, which I will say I hate. And I'm so glad people like Bill Singford do it and do it well because it's probably my least favorite thing in the world. I ended up, you know, on all these right-wing shows, like, ugh. But I did it because I did it. And because there I was. We were like water skiing behind a big yacht because they had such a publicity machine that everyone was calling us. So it was quite an amazing time. And Equal Partners in Faith ended up hiring Mandy Carter to be the director of that effort. Mandy had been, and still is, a longtime North Carolina activist. And she really did a whole lot of work around the right and the Black church. So that's probably enough reminiscing. I want to talk about why, besides that it's fun to reminisce, why I think this is relevant now. I think those memories are not just for those of us who were there, But because we are now facing a time where the far-right groups are once again on the ascent, and I hope we can learn from the successes and the failures of the stories I've shared. We can feel proud of all the strides that the GLBT community has made with marriage equality, media visibility, and a move towards overall acceptance. But the authorization that the Trump administration gave to hate and cruelty has unleashed new energy to reverse those gains. Once again, as was happening in the 1990s, the right is trying out a variety of approaches to oppression through state and local and federal challenges. The blatant and violent racism that Trump authorized and unleashed from the far-right groups is very visible. Most of those groups are also profoundly misogynistic, but it's really important to know that the anti-queer work has not gone away. Much of the right to discriminate is cloaked in language of religious freedom, and the anti-queer groups have religious sounding names or are church groups. And much of the anti-queer work specifically targets trans people and communities and trans equality. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the number of anti-LGBTQ hate groups rose from 49 in 2018 to 70 in 2019. And it says this in that report: groups that vilify the LGBTQ community, in fact, represented the fastest growing sector among hate groups in 2019. The surge in anti-LGBTQ groups occurred amidst an overall decrease in hate groups, which is hard to believe for me, but which dropped to 940 from an all-time high of 1020. I bet they're going up again. The report said that the surge was, quote, possibly fueled by continued anti-LGBTQ sentiment and policy emanating from government officials, largely attributing it to the Trump administration. They described, quote, an unprecedented blizzard of state laws targeted at transgender people. These include efforts to prohibit transgender healthcare for minors, prevent trans students from participating in girls' sports, barring trans people from changing gender markers on their ID. That the battles over access to bathrooms make it clear how cruel and dehumanizing these organizers truly are. The FBI's most recent hate crime statistics report, released in November, found nearly 20% of all reported hate crimes were motivated by anti-LGBTQ bias. And the most growth was seen in reports of anti-trans violence, which increased 34% year over year. As always, and this is the horror of intersectionality, Black trans women and trans women of color and Indigenous trans women are most likely to be assaulted or killed. I'll just sit with that for a moment. The religious landscape is profoundly different now than it was in the early 1990s. Most mainline Protestants, with the exception of the Methodists, have found their way to affirming LGBTQ ministers and marriages, and the Methodists are moving towards a split in the denomination over the issue. There are more easily accessible allies, and there are allies organizing in the Black churches too. Folks like Reverend Cedric Harmon, who was once on the board of Equal Partners in Faith, is now director of Many Voices, a Black church movement for gay and transgender justice. Do you have a picture of that? No. Oh, I skipped. That was the Promise Keepers. And that, oh, sorry. I skipped a few. There's Cedric. Most of the DC groups I worked with in the early 90s have long since hired organizers to work with religious communities, and many of them have brought on board people to work specifically with Black and people of color and Indigenous religious communities. Groups like the Marsha P. Johnson Institute and the Audre Lorde Center work explicitly from intersectional places. And within Unitarian Universalism, the Transforming Hearts Collective, run by Alex Capitan and Michael Slack and others, works this is their description. We are queer, transgender, non-binary, and cisgender people of many races, classes, abilities, spiritualities, and ages. We are change agents rooted in a vision and goal of liberation for all. So there is good leadership, good organizing, but it is not a time for any of us to hang back and hope that other people will do things and good things will happen. I know that there are people here from a variety of places, and I hope that wherever you are, you will find hubs of activism that you can support to do this intersectional work. Often for me as an older white person, what support means doesn't mean stepping out front as a leader. It means supporting the leadership that's already there, the people who know the best. Finally, I'll refer you to the Side with Love campaign's 30 Days of Love, which we're right in the middle of now. That's a place to dig in and find some other folks to dig in to do this essential work. I think I can safely say that in this virtual room, we're all tremendously relieved that the former occupant of the White House has gone, but the judges he appointed, the groups he gave support to, the people elected with the same agendas are on the rise, and it's time for every one of us to assess where we can effectively confront and challenge and resist. I'll close with these words from Adrienne Rich, which have been a compass for me as imperfectly as I may have lived them. May they be our guide. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age perversely with no extraordinary power reconstitute the world. Thank you so much.